Thank you, everyone. Welcome and good morning. I want to do three things with my short time here this morning. I want to give a little bit of a contemporary context. Where are we right now? What are the challenges we are facing, both as individuals, as organizations, and as society? So, that's the first thing, a contemporary background. The second thing is to look at the societal changes, the societal challenges. So if we have many personal individual challenges, what are our collective challenges and what is the collective transformation that we are going through, perhaps, right now? And then the third thing will be exactly look at history. To look at Scandinavia, the Scandinavian context, the Swedish context, and see how did we manage this challenge historically and what has brought us as a society to where we are today. And I'm going to do this in 20 minutes, so you will have to bear with me that this will be very rapid, and you can be sure that we will, during this day, come back to many of the things that I will just briefly mention. So, if we start with the world today, and I think that most of you are familiar with this diagram. It is a value survey that is done every 5 years in more than 100 countries, and this has been going on for many years. The Scandinavian countries are in a unique position up there. And we could ask ourselves, how did we end up in that position? And what does it really mean to be up there, both for a society but also for us as individuals? And of course we should know that these dots here that represent each country are just averages. Around them are of course larger clusters where all the individuals in the countries are. But somehow, if you look at historical data, and again this survey has been going on for more than 40 years, you can see a trend. Most countries on the average are somehow moving up to that corner. Before we start talking about the challenges today, which are many, I think it's worthwhile to remember that we are actually living in our grandparents' dreams. This photograph there of some young kids, they are probably between 12 and 14 years of age. They could all have been my grandfathers. Or even my grandfather, when that picture was taken in almost exactly 100 years ago. He was actually older than those guys. The world that they could dream of even is well beyond where we have reached today. And this is not just us in the rich countries. If you look at Hans Rosling's statistics, for example, I would say that 90% of people on the planet today live in a society with amenities that my grandparents would only have dreamed of when they were kids. So that's the positive side. And what has achieved this? Of course, it's the technological development. This is what has achieved all of these good things. But then at the same time, this technological development has got a backside. The world is becoming more and more complex. It's becoming more and more difficult for us as individuals and as society to navigate this world. And now we're really seeing some serious threats even to our societal systems. I believe that all these problems that we are facing today are not different problems. They are all symptoms on the same underlying problem. They are not individual crises. They are all part of a meta-crisis. And this meta-crisis is really a question of the fact that our brain was developed in an environment that was characterized by constant technological environment. It was what some people call an empty planet, meaning that we could really just use the natural resources without thinking too much about it. And it was an environment that was characterized by scarcity. Now, all of a sudden, we are in a world of constant change, a world where we have a potential of abundance of well-being, and it should be possible for us to do that within planetary boundaries, because right now we are in what some people call a full planet. We are already using more than one planet. We are in an unsustainable situation. And it's still the same brain we have. And even if the brain is plastic, even if the brain can develop, I would like to focus on the mind. Because the plasticity of the brain is there, but it's limited. But our mind has got a potential for development. And that is really what we are going to talk about today. When we're talking about adult development, it's the question not so much of if our brain can develop. It can. But the question is, can our mind develop all through our life? And what can support that development? And then, of course, we have society. And society is also developing. To understand this process of the developing mind, to understand adult development, one can do that from two perspectives. One is to do it from the real deep end, from the theoretical end. And we will hear during this day both Professor Keegan and Dr. Cook-Reuter talk about their views on development of our mind, about adult development. I want to point to two books. One is of Christian Solna, who is here and who will be speaking after me. So you will mention your book, Vuxen men inte färdig. And then I would like to specifically mention Kristina's book, Livsutvecklingens psykologi, that is actually coming out next week. So we have a few early copies arriving this afternoon to our book table, and I could really recommend this book. These are examples of trying to understand the development of our mind from a very complex modeling perspective. The other way of doing it is what we are trying to do in this little white paper that Christine Mellner has, who is also here today, has helped us to develop. In this paper, we are really asking the question the other way around. This complex issue of adult development, could we really break that down into the smaller components? Could we talk about the skills that we need to develop as individuals to be able to flourish in this new, rapidly moving, complex world? And what we are doing there is that we are naming 5 groups of these skills that we think that we all need to develop in this world. And we call those skills transformative skills. And just very rapidly going through them, we are talking about the need to increase our ability to be open to this rapidly changing world. Open to the world, but also open inside, open to our feelings, our emotions, our values. We talk about the ability to be perspective-seeking, to actively seek more perspectives in this complex world. We talk about sense-making, and making sense in a deeper, more complex, more nuanced way of the world around us and the world inside us. We're talking about developing an inner compass. And, not the least, we're talking about developing compassion and extending our compassion in larger and larger circles of belonging. The good news is that all of these clusters of skills, because they are really clusters of many skills that you can order under these headings, that it is that you are not born with a certain amount of these skills. These skills can be developed. You're not born with a limited amount of ability to take perspectives or a limited amount of compassion. It has been scientifically conclusively shown that these sorts of skills can be developed. That's the good news. The bad news, or the challenge, is that they cannot be taught in a traditional manner. You cannot send somebody in your company that you think would need to develop compassion on a 3-day compassion training course, and then they come back all compassionate. No, that's unfortunately not possible. Now, all of these dimensions, we could call it, of ego development, all these dimensions or components of ego development can be developed, but they require changing in deeper psychological processes that only take place in an immersive learning environment and over time, and cannot be forced. Can be facilitated, but cannot be forced. That is the reason why Ekskäret Foundation, we got our island, because I personally believe that nature is a catalyst for these sorts of transformative learning, for development. And that has always been where I personally have had the possibility to connect more deeply with deeper layers in myself. That has been out in nature, out in the mountains or out in the archipelago. So at the island, we are doing youth camps during the summer, and in the winter we're doing invitational conferences and retreats for adult development, where we are really trying to experiment on how can we facilitate the development of these kinds of transformative skills. And developing these transformative skills, we believe, is the same thing, or will at least lead to this more nebulous concept of adult development or ego development. So that's the transformative power of nature and of authentic meetings, authentic dialogue. But also, but we are also, and now I think it's the wrong presentation. Okay. Because in my last presentation that I sent, I had here a slide talking about our digital project called 29K, 29,000. That's the number of days you hopefully will have in a long and healthy life. And that is a digital initiative that is run by one of the board members of Ekskäret Foundation, Erik Fernholm. And Erik, if someone wants to speak to Erik during lunch, he is here. This is a project that we are doing together with the rkman Foundation, and here we are exploring the possibilities for digital support and a digital complement to the efforts of inner growth. Okay, so then we can see that so far I've been talking about the individual component. The fact that we as individuals are overwhelmed, as Professor Keegan would say, we are in over our heads often in today's complex society, and we need to develop our inner world to match the complexity of our outer world. But if we leave the individual perspective and look a little bit on the societal perspective, society has also gone through transformation. And society and civilizations have transformed a number of times during history. And of course, amongst other things, it is the technological development that has been forcing civilizations to either transform or disappear. And a model of these kinds of societal transformations or paradigm shifts is the Berkana model from the Berkana Institute in the US, where we are talking about an old paradigm disappearing, reaching its end, and a new paradigm emerging. And the last time we had this huge societal shift, or paradigm shift, here in Europe was during the Enlightenment, when we went from a religious, dogmatic worldview into a scientific, rational worldview. And back then, the old paradigm came from the early medieval ages. It had its peak at the high Middle Ages, and then we had technological development. We had the printing press developing. Not only the printing press, but certainly the printing press being one important change. And this led to the French Revolution, to the Napoleonic Wars, a big time of turbulence, of transition, and something came out of that transition, and that is what we today call modernity. But it wasn't an easy transition in most places in Europe. It was a time of revolution, it was a time of blood, it was a time of war that lasted between 50 and 100 years of chaos. But out came modernity. And of course this paradigm of modernity, the Enlightenment paradigm, is what has given us all these wonderful things, but has also given us all these problems now, when we are starting to reach the limit of what this paradigm can deliver. So, I believe that we are now facing a similar paradigmatic transition, a paradigm shift again. And this time, the old paradigm is the modern world, is modernity, is the Enlightenment paradigm, which here in Scandinavia had its peak in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, when it was still possible to plan a rational society. But then again, technological development happened. Many different things, but not the least internet. And that has put the world in turmoil. And all of these crises that we see, I think, is the beginning of a new paradigm shift. And hopefully something new will emerge. And we don't know what that is. And I don't think we can plan for it. But we can certainly help and facilitate this transition, this birth of a new paradigm. One could connect that, and now again, let me see if I have the... Yeah, no. Okay. So I mentioned that the shift in Europe was very turbulent. Whereas here in Scandinavia, we had a relatively peaceful transition into modernity. And we actually moved all the way up to the super modern corner of this diagram. And we did that peacefully. And the question is, why did this happen peacefully in Scandinavia? And why did we end up in that corner? And that brings me to my last part, and that is the historical part. And my co-author, Lena Andersen, who is a Danish philosopher and author, and I wrote the book The Nordic Secret, where we try to explain the secret behind both this transition into modernity and the reason why we are up in that very special corner. And it's very easy to forget that all the Nordic countries, not that long ago, at the end of the 1800s, were actually the poorest countries in Europe. We were dirt poor, people were starving. During the last decades of the 1800s, 30% of the working population in Sweden emigrated, mostly to the US, because we were starving. We couldn't find work. We were non-democratic, agrarian societies. But then just a few generations later, even before the Second World War, we have all of a sudden become happy, rich, stable industrial democracies. And the question is, how did we end up there? And the secret there, that is not very commonly known, is that we, in all the Nordic countries, 150 to 100 years ago, had extraordinary visionary leaders and intellectuals who knew that in times of rapid societal transition, high complexity, it is so common for us humans, so natural for us humans, to try to hold on to some sort of stability outside ourselves, to try to find some sort of outside authority to rely on. It could be dogmatic religion, or it could be an authoritarian leader. It could be an Erdogan or a Trump. But these visionary intellectuals and politicians, they did not want to be those authoritarian leaders. They were firmly committed to build democracy. And they knew that the only way to build stable and lasting democracies are to build them from bottom up. So they wanted to create lots of active co-creators of democracy that had actually, in their own language back then, become what we today call self-authoring, that had found their own inner compass, that had become so grounded in themselves that they could hold the complexity of societal transformation without having to rely on an external authority. So where did they get these insights from? Well, they got it from the German idealist philosophers. And back then in Scandinavia, everyone at university read German. That was our first language. It was Goethe, Schiller, Herder, von Humboldt, Hegel, all of those names. And they had all pointed out that the reason why the French Revolution went bad, they had put so much hope in the French Revolution, was that an insufficient amount of people in France actually had developed the inner compass and inner strength and had become self-authoring. They said, we do not need a majority, but we need a significant number. So that is what these Scandinavian people wanted to do. And in Sweden we had names like Hjalmar Branting, Prime Minister 3 times later, Karl Staff, also Prime Minister 2 times for the Liberals, and one of our first feminist champions, Ellen Key. People like that, they said, this is what we need to do. We need to help a significant part of our people and ourselves to become self-authoring. So do you know what they did? Okay, sorry, I've got no time to explain. So. No, what they did was that they opened up retreat centers for inner growth. And they opened up on scale. So, started in Denmark, moved on to Norway, then to Sweden, and before the year 1900, we had 100 retreat centers in Denmark, 75 in Norway, and 150 in Sweden, where young adults could spend up to 6 months in retreat with the explicit purpose of finding their inner compass and becoming co-creators of modernity. And when this was at its height, 10% of each young generation in Sweden went to one of these folkhögskolor. Okay. Today, this is the last slide. Today, we will be talking about deliberately developmental organizations. How can we create an organization where everyone can grow and participate in the development? What these guys did 100 years ago was that they created a deliberately developmental society. And that is what I think we need to do again. Thank you.